Welcome back, everybody, to Left Reckoning. David here, joined by Matt Leck as always.
Howdy.
And we're very lucky and happy that she was able to make some time for us to be joined today by Assal Rad. Assal Rad is the research director at the National Iranian American Council. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, guys, and covering this obviously very important topic.
Yeah, I mean, let's dive into it. So, Mahsa Amini was visiting Tehran, um, where she was apprehended by the morality police, and she passed away. I mean, could you help people understand who might not be following this or might not really know what's going on? What exactly happened and why this struck such a chord in Iran?
Well, the reports that surfaced now about 2 weeks ago was that the first reports that came out was that after being detained by morality police, we put it in quotes because it's absurd, but she was in a coma within hours, and then the following day it was announced that, or at least again, reports surfaced that they announced her having died. But of course, the way Iranian authorities tried to spin this, and this is why they released immediately this footage of Mahsa Amini sort of like walking around after she had been detained. But then you also see her collapse, right? So you see the collapse, and there are eyewitnesses that say they saw her being beaten in the police van. And of course, this idea that this 22-year-old person who her family says was in perfect health just died of a stroke or a heart attack, coincidentally after she had been detained by, the so-called morality police, is obviously ridiculous. I mean, there's so many ways that you can look at it in terms of why they are clearly responsible. Number one, the fact that she should never have been detained. And I think this is one of the most important points to make. She should never have been detained because women should be free to wear whatever attire they want. But the fact that not only the craziest part is that she was abiding, in the sense of the way that many millions of Iranian women who have to go out in this sort of strict attire do so. But under this administration, the Raisi administration, we've seen an increase in just crackdowns across the spectrum, across all sectors of Iranian society. Just a few months ago, we saw arrests of two different directors, one of them Jafar Panahi, who's a well-known Iranian filmmaker. So this isn't an incident that we can think of as an anomaly within a system that allows this kind of violence and restrictions against its own civilian population. It is very much emblematic of the nature of that system. And so, you have eyewitnesses saying that she was beaten. You have the fact that she actually did die. So she was killed. She was killed by the morality police. There's no other way of getting around it. And I know that there's attempts to do so, especially on the side of Iranian authorities. But the reality of it is, had she not been detained for something like how much of her hair was showing, she would be alive today. And she is not. And that is the responsibility of the individual actors who used force against her, and the state at large, which allows this kind of violence to be carried out with no accountability, with impunity. And we are seeing that impunity in the way that protests, not just now, but a history of protests, have been dealt with by Iranian authorities.
And I definitely we're going to spend some time talking about the protests because they have been so widespread in ways that I think are really interesting for people who follow what's going on in Iran. But I mean, just to sort of help people understand, because I think there's a lot of confusion. And actually, from my understanding, there's confusion both in the US and in Iran about what is proper hijab, attire, right? Like this is something that has sort of changed over time, what is acceptable. Particularly in different regions. I mean, could you sort of, help people understand who might not really get what the morality police is, what those kind of expectations are on people? Because I think that's a really important component to the story as well.
So after the revolution of 1979, very short, like a month into the revolution, the newly formed Islamic Republic announced that it would become law that women would have to cover themselves. And this was a shock to many women who participated, who were participants in that revolution, and some of which even used the hijab as a symbol of resistance against the previous monarchy, not because the monarch had outlawed hijab. In terms of the historical record, to be clear, his father, back in the 1930s, had outlawed certain types of Islamic garb, like the chador, which is a sheet-like garb that some traditional or conservative Iranian women wear. But it was, you were allowed to wear a hijab, you were allowed to wear Islamic garb under the monarchy, under the last Shah. But there was a sort of sense of disenfranchisement of that population, of more conservative. If you were to dress in this conservative way, in this traditional way, then maybe you would be discriminated against in a job situation, right? Because it was the atmosphere of the society at the time, and so it was used at that time with that kind of symbolism. Of course, right when it became imposed, it went in the exact opposite direction, because the idea of these symbols and how they're often used should be understood within the historical context and how they're used, right? Right now, when you look at protesters, for some, there's the idea that they're against the religion as a whole, and that's not necessarily true. Though there are likely people who are disaffected with the religion, with Islam, because of the theocratic nature of their own government. These are not anti-religious protests. These are protests for freedom, right? These are protests for the freedom of choice because this was imposed on them. And the day after, on the first International Women's Day after the revolution on March 8th, 1979, women held protests across the country with no hijab on, as this was a very new sort of decree. So this is not, this isn't a sudden situation. This is an ongoing, from the day that this was imposed, it has been resisted by Iranian women. Of course, it's been enforced. But depending on the administration that is in power, depending on the political climate, how it is enforced, how strictly it is enforced, changes over time. And so during the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, especially in the early 2000s, that was one of the periods in which you saw sort of stricter enforcement, and this Gasht Ershad, that's the morality police, these vans that are, spread across different cities and areas, basically policing how you look, your attire. And women, one of the ways in their everyday actions that Iranian women and men, in their own respect, in their own regard, one thing to keep in mind is men also have a dress code. It's just much less strict than women's dress code. But to understand that the society as a whole, the way that they resist these restrictions can sometimes be seen in the way that they actually wear the hijab, the fact that they wear it loosely, right? If you are wearing it by choice, if you're devout and wearing it by choice, you would likely wear it very differently than the way many young, especially Iranian women, wear it. So that is, in a way, their own sort of resistance by wearing it loosely. But now with this administration, with the Raisi administration, which is ultra-conservative, hardline, has shown in different positions that he's held when he was head of the judiciary, has shown clearly he has no regard for Iranian life, the life of these human beings. That enforcement has become more strict, and the culmination of that is in this horrific and tragic event where this young woman was killed simply for her headscarf, how her headscarf was placed. But the reason why there's some confusion, I think, is that exactly right. People not knowing exactly what the history is. For how long has this been imposed? What does it mean that it's imposed, and how do people look when they do it? And I think, to go back to your previous question, one of the reasons why there's such an emotional response to this particular event is because that Mahsa Amini could have been anyone. It could have been any young girl that was in the country, because she wasn't doing anything that basically, millions of other women do. They wear their headscarves loosely. So I think that, combined with the absurdity of the fact that this is actually a reason why police would detain someone and then use force against them, is part of what elicits this kind of outrage and reaction, and rightfully so.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that, well, before we get to that, excuse me. I mean, these protests have been extremely widespread, and I think what a lot of people have been noting is the different kind of social bases that have been like showing up in the streets in protest here. I mean, could you give people a sense of the scale and some of the tactics and slogans and what's really going on with these protests right now?
So if you look at these protests, one of the reasons why they are sustained and widespread is, and how they might be different than previous protests, is in 2000. So the last time we saw large scale protests in Iran was in November of 2019. And well, actually, to be fair, it was January of 2020 because, but in this sort of similar parallel, and we can get into
Mhm.
January of 2020. But in November of 2019, when there were wide scale protests, it was sparked by an announcement that that gas prices were going to be hiked quite dramatically overnight. And so the immediate reaction to that came from working class and poorer segments of Iranian society because they were the first to be impacted by that. Now, even in those protests, what you see are deeper grievances being expressed. They might be sparked by something,
Mhm.
but then once they are sparked, they take a different shape. If you look back at 2009, when there was very organized, widespread protests across the country, which lasted months, that was in the wake of the 2009 election, which was contested, and the ensuing Green Movement, which also got a lot of international attention. Now, that was based on a political grievance. The first sort of slogan in that one was "Where is my vote?" calling for accountability for the elections. But again, that quickly evolved into going at the core of the system that simply doesn't work for in terms of fulfilling the desires and wishes of the Iranian people. That was largely middle class, and also in Tehran. You had very large protests in Tehran in 2009 versus 2019 was spread outside of Tehran quite a bit, and you had different classes involved. Right now, you see the middle class back in protests. This is a social issue. This is a women's rights issue. This is a freedom issue. And that's the center of it. That's what sparked it. And that's why, I mean, it's important to acknowledge and recognize that, again, the slogans are going to the core of the system. When they're saying death to the dictator, which is
Mhm.
a ubiquitous slogan right now, then that goes to the core of the system itself. It shows these deeper grievances that exist, that go beyond, women's rights and women's freedom. But I also don't want to overlook that that is at the center,
Mhm.
because that's why you see so many young people, so many young women not only giving their lives, right, being killed in these protests, but participating in them, taking center stage in them. These images of, just young women burning their hijabs, walking around without it. I mean, the courage it takes to stand up to a state that has clearly shown that it is not afraid to use violence against you is, we can constantly say that it's inspiring, but we lack the words to describe just how much courage that takes. So that is also the center of the story, but it goes beyond that. It goes beyond that into larger grievances. I mean, Iranians have, in the last 5 or so years, have suffered a lot.
Mhm.
There's a lot of, the Iranian economy has been in a downward spiral for several years. They deal with hyperinflation, unemployment, they lose buying power. The economic struggles that they are going through are part of what creates this rage across the board. But on top of that, rather than having authorities or officials that try to actually help their own people, you've also seen an increase in repression. You've seen in the last several months arrests of journalists, like I said, filmmakers, more and more repression of any form of dissidence within the society. It is almost as if you are not as if, it's quite clearly the case that they're trying to make. You cannot criticize or have any notion of dissent within that state. So all of these things now add a pandemic that we've all been through, and now this, horrible events, and you can see how things boil over. They boil over with pressure, so much pressure building on them, and no and being allowed no space for release, no space for expression.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's been truly, inspiring to see the images and the solidarity shown by people. You've seen some really horrific, you know, photographs of people who've been injured, and I think it's worth for people to understand the scope of the violence that people have experienced. State media saying something around like 41 people, including security personnel, have been killed, while other groups are saying that death toll is much higher. And it's just important to recognize the bravery that it takes to go out there knowing that those are the circumstances and continue to being in the streets and moving. And I was wondering, because I mean these have been going on for a decent amount of time. I mean, how do you feel about the momentum of these protests as time has gone on? Do you feel like it's slowing down, or you think that it's continuing to grow in its fervor?
So I wouldn't call it slowing down. I would say that the state is trying to squash them, right?
Hmm.
It's not that protesters aren't coming out, it's that they're being repressed.
Hmm.
And that's happening through mass arrests, that's happening through not only like violently dealing with protesters, but using deadly force, which is why a number of people we know at least 40 people have died. There's other human rights organizations that are saying no, the number is closer in the 70s, but we don't really know, and it's
Hmm.
likely much higher than anything that we are seeing. I mean, when you say it's Iranian media that's saying it's 41, I think is the death toll. So we clearly would have to take that with a grain of salt and recognize the fact that when they're shutting down the internet, that's because they don't want
Hmm.
communication with the outside. I mean, these are choices that are being made by authorities to cover up to a certain extent what's going on. So it's not that it's being slowed down, it's being quelled, it's being repressed. And that is the pattern that we have seen multiple times. And that's why I brought up 2009. In 2009, protests went on for months. They didn't go on for weeks. They went on technically for months. I mean, the election was in June, where you saw so in the month of June you saw a lot of protests going into the month of July. But then even in December of that year, there was still another large scale protest that was directly connected to the Green Movement. That I think of something like 8 people died in that protest, and that was in December of 2009. So to for authorities in Iran to think that we're just going to quell this and it's going to go away is clearly not
Hmm.
true. There's just no truth in that kind of analysis. It is not going away because it has not gone away. And if you really wanted to contextualize historically what we are seeing, and I'm a little biased because I'm a historian, but it goes way further back. I mean, Iranians have been fighting for these sort of basic concepts of constitutionalism, representative government, freedom, democracy for well over a century. And every iteration of protest we've seen, decade through decade through decade, before and after the revolution, has always been to fulfill those promises. And they have yet to see that happen. Something that was believed, at least in when the revolution occurred, the belief was that's what they were fighting for. But of course, that's not what came to pass. So it's not going to go away,
Hmm.
even if we were to say the state uses just immense amounts of violence, represses these protests, and for now they're quiet. The idea is not going to go away, and I think these protests are another sort of watershed moment because there's a couple of things that seem different about it. One is that Iranians are using force back,
Hmm.
right? Um, they are actually not only defending themselves, but they're fighting back because they have faced nothing but violence. And now they are understanding that they are allowed to fight back. They are allowed to defend themselves in that fashion. So um, there is more of a stance in that sense. And also just the level of defiance, right? I mean, you theoretically you have probably tens of millions of women in the country who don't want to wear the hijab. Are they going to arrest what? 10
Hmm.
million women? 20 million women? How many people can you arrest? So you're seeing women just take it off, right? Just defying it to that point. And so I think that this level of defiance hopefully shows a turning point. And I say hopefully because what you want to see is that the calls of these protesters are heeded. What you want to see, I mean, in an ideal situation, you just want to see democracy overnight.
Hmm.
But the reality on the ground is it is unlikely that the people who are currently in power sort of concede um, will concede that power. Nonetheless, as people resist, which is historically what's happened not only in Iran but everywhere else, as people resist, certain things will have to be conceded until until everything is fulfilled that they want. And so, it's hard. You can't predict. I can't predict. Not me. Nobody can. You
Yeah.
cannot predict when what will happen, and maybe in the short term they'll be able to quell something, but in the long term this is unsustainable because you simply cannot silence a country of 80 plus million people, tens of millions of which do not agree with not only the laws but the way that the system is run itself.
And I mean, I would imagine they're probably keeping things pretty tight-lipped. But I was curious if you've noticed any kind of, I don't know, fragmentation from mainly political figures, but also maybe larger public figures. I know, for example, one of the players on the Iranian national soccer team put out a post on Instagram. I think he plays in Europe, so he's not living there regularly, but he put out a post in support of the protest. I think it was deleted a few hours later, but that was a pretty notable one. I was just curious if you've seen or have heard of much kind of fragmentation. Again, I would imagine a lot of people in power and government wouldn't be expressing their concerns publicly, but I'm
There's
curious.
actually, I mean, the institution of government, I mean, the government is a gigantic bureaucracy. Not
Hmm.
everybody in the government is the same. The country is not a monolith. The government is not a monolith. And so, or not even the government, but people who are, or former officials, or however you want to look at it. So there was a statement early on, I think, from a group of reformist politicians that basically said you should, abolish the morality police and get rid of the dress code. So and there is internal debate about everything in the political realm, in the same way that we experience here, right? There's tons of
Hmm.
disagreement, and there are there's extreme poles of views, and then there are the people who come into the center. So um, Iran has a similar, both in its civil society and within its political institutions, has similar degrees of diversity of views and thought. So that certainly exists there. But I think there's a, a fair amount. Does every single person in the country agree? No, nobody could ever make that
Hmm.
statement. But I think there is a fair amount of unity across Iranian civil society um, that absolutely condemns. I mean, there's just who doesn't condemn murdering a 22-year-old girl
Yeah.
because of photo showing.
Mm.
So that in and of itself, there's clear condemnation across the spectrum. Support for the protesters, and actually having sort of like celebrities or prominent members of the society come out and make statements, that has been something that we've seen in the last few weeks quite a bit. You had the Iranian national team had a friendly game, I think 2 days ago, against, I forgot who the game was against, but the important
Hmm.
point of it was they all wore black jackets over their jerseys, over their clothes, in a show of solidarity with the protesters. That's the national soccer team.
Yeah.
Every player coming out in a black jacket. You've had actors, uh, different artists come out again in support of the protesters. Musicians come out in support of the protesters. Videos that they are releasing, tweet threads that they are sharing everywhere on social media, because there is unity in supporting a cause that at its core is a cause for freedom. That is what they're ultimately asking for. They're asking for
Mhm.
freedom. So that is, it's a cause I think everybody can get behind. And that's also in part why you see so much international solidarity, right?
Mhm.
There's you, you're captivated by this sort of story because it's such a horrible, tragic story, and then seeing the bravery of these protesters, the fact that they're so young, right? I think
Hmm.
the average age of protesters who have been killed is something like 26, I want to say, maybe even younger. So you have really kids, like in their late teens, their early 20s, um, who are just fighting for basic freedoms, for opportunity, for what so many take for granted in so many other places. So I think that's why you're seeing this kind of solidarity and this kind of unity uh, across the board.
And I kind of want to ask how you think that might age, and if history of these sorts of protests in the past show any guide to what we can expect from a reaction. Because when we're talking about this, I'm thinking of the George Floyd protests and how a lot of people came out in support of them. And actually, there's a similarity with how the state tried to lie and say, like, it actually wasn't the cops responsible for his death. And a lot of people, even on the right, were, I think, muted as that was going on. And now we have, looking back on it, a narrative on the right, reactionary right, saying that summer was mainly about Democrats allowing cities to be burned down to get Trump out of office. I'm curious, like, is there what might is this too popular? There won't be a sort of mass reaction against it, or what might a mass reaction look like?
Well, I mean, when you use that kind of parallel, what's interesting about it is that you have the same situation now, right? There's on the state side, right? It's not like they're accepting the fact that these are legitimate protests with people who have legitimate grievances. In fact, the way that Iranian officials are trying to frame the entire thing is that these aren't protests. This is outside intervention.
Mm,
This is pressure coming from the outside. This is a plot. That kind of thinking, and it parallels with what you just said, because it was like, well, this isn't really about Black Lives Matter. This is about Democrats, and it's like, no,
Hmm.
that's not what it's about.
mhm.
And it undermines the agency of the people who are participating in these protests. And by the way, that's precisely what the Iranian government did in 2009, right? In 2009, that was the narrative. These were not protests. This was agitation. These were agitators who were being, pressed by outside foreign powers who were trying to overthrow the government. And this was the only lens through which they tried to um, not understand it, because they didn't try to understand it, but how they tried to at least publicly portray it. And so you see that happening now too. And it, you know, fully, what's interesting to me is the lack of consistency in the way that so many people talk about protests depending on where they are, right? So the very people that you are talking about right now in the US officials and politicians who completely rejected the legitimacy or the grievances of Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of George Floyd's killing are outspoken in support of protesters in Iran right now. And so that is one of the problems in the way that we talk about things. Injustice is injustice. It doesn't matter where it is, and it doesn't matter who it targets. We should be better at being able to speak out against injustice, no matter what it is, and no matter where it is, and no matter who the target is. So, so I just thought, I mean, when you brought up that, in my mind, I was like, oh, it's funny. Some of those people think these are totally justified. For some reason, when it happens in their own country, it's not as, they use the same kind of state controlled language when it doesn't fit what they want.
Right.
Let's jump into that a little bit more, because um on one hand, the last time we had you on the program, we were talking about the Biden administration's continuation of Trump's policies, and reminding people about just how devastating the sanctions have been on Iran. And it's one of those things where I think it's worthwhile for an American audience to recognize that part of the reason that Raisi is able to come into power is because you see the Iran deal crumble, you see all this kind of chaos. It's like, oh look, that's what happens when we negotiate with the United States. And just remember that these things have like a really big effect on people's lives. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the narratives that we're getting here on two sides, right? One, we're seeing some people who are very hawkish on Iran, sort of maybe using this as an excuse to maybe ratchet up more sanctions, more isolation. And then I've also seen people sort of in our camp on like the on the side of anti-imperialism, who want to end these sanctions, saying things along the lines of, if you're supporting these protests, if you're amplifying these protests, you're only working to destabilize Iran and help out people like John Bolton. I'll hold my tongue. That argument makes me very angry, I will just say. But I would be, would you be able to help us walk through, you know, the tensions within that argument, and also like how we can be showing solidarity and support for people without necessarily being credibly accused, for example, of running cover for a Bolton or somebody like that who might want to increase tension and sanctions with Iran.
Right. And I think this is a really important point to bring up, because I have seen similar kinds of arguments from the left. And while I often, agree with a lot of the arguments about, like being anti-imperialist, being against sanctions that, Iran is just one country, right? What about sanctions that are on Afghanistan, or our economic policies towards Afghanistan, which is helping to starve Afghans? That doesn't mean that the Taliban is good and is not to blame for anything. Clearly, every state, the first node of responsibility is the government of that state, and that's why people of those populations will target their own country more than any other, their own government, their own ruling powers, because that's who you naturally target. And so I understand, broadly speaking, anti-imperialist leftist arguments, but we have to have, this is what I mean by consistency. Like, we have to have the ability to have consistency. It is on the left that we so often criticize hawkish policies for lacking nuance, right? We always say that, but there's no nuance. They're just painting everything as black and white. But isn't the left doing the same thing, when in this case, it's not, you're not showing solidarity by sort of reducing these protests, by saying, this is outside. It's the same thing. Like, you're basically repeating the talking points of an authoritarian state. It is what it is. Just because, here's the thing that's always been the problem. The Iranian government, the Islamic Republic, is an authoritarian state. I don't think anybody who argues against this. This is a fact. That doesn't mean that the US should put broad-based unilateral sanctions that sanction its entire financial sector, that forces middle-class people into poverty, and people who are already into poverty into desperation. Two things can be wrong at the same time. And this is lost for some reason, in the sense that they think Iranian people, or people in any of these states, don't understand this. Of course they blame their own governments, but they can also recognize when two things are hurting them at the same time. Even if they're not on equal levels, it's still occurring at the same time. So, we use human rights language when we talk about the protests in Iran right now and what sparked them, as we should. But there is also human rights language applied to sanctions. So the same organizations, the same human rights groups, the United Nations, all of them during the pandemic said that we should ease sanctions, not just on Iran, all sanctioned countries, as there's a global attempt to combat the pandemic. That was completely ignored by the United States. But that is human rights language too. So that becomes the question. It's like, we just have to be consistent in the way that we talk about it, that we understand that, again, two things can be bad at once. We know the mandatory hijab law in Iran has zero to do with US sanctions. That is a choice that they make. The brute force that they use on protesters, zero to do with sanctions. That is something that they do. The fact that they enforce these draconian laws, zero to do with sanctions. That's on them. Of course it is. And we should be able to have that conversation, right? We should be able to recognize that, no, they do things that we should condemn. They do things that are horrible, that are authoritarian, and hurt those people too. Because ultimately that should be the what we're concerned about. What is hurting ordinary civilians in any situation that we're talking about? And if it's our policies that are hurting them, we should be saying it. And if it's their own policies that are hurting them, we should be saying it. And it shouldn't be that hard. So to show solidarity is literally show solidarity. Say something, stop. I've had people comment things like, almost disparaging this idea that this entire thing is about hair. I'm like, that's not
Yeah.
what this is about. That's such a reduction. That's so insulting. It's so insulting to these people who are literally dying to say that that's what they're dying for. That's not what they're dying for. They know that the state is using force against them, and yet they go out and do it. They go out knowing that they're risking their lives. No one is risking their lives because they're so obsessed with the notion that they want their hair to show. This is an issue of freedom. This is an issue of women's rights. This is an issue that goes beyond, that's why I said it goes at the core of the system. It goes at a core of a system that does not serve its people. And while it doesn't serve its people, our policies don't serve those people either. That has been the argument. That should be the argument on the left. The left should not be falling into the exact sort of hypocrisy that we accuse hawkish voices of doing, right? We have to be consistent if we expect others to be consistent as well. And I think this has been one of the frustrating features of this is, let's just show solidarity. Let's just be honest about the conversations that we're having, acknowledge the brute force with which protesters are being met, and listen to them. Listen to the voices that are inside of Iran. Listen to what they're saying. It is their country. It is their lives. It is their future. What are they saying? Listen to that and base your sort of conclusions on that. And yes, across the board, they are saying death to the dictator. And that's one of the things that they're saying. There's other slogans. One of the central slogans, one of the sort of starting slogans was actually women, life, freedom. Right. And I think that so sort of beautifully sums up the very simple concept of what this is about. At the center of it is women, but it is about just the ability for everyone in the society to live their lives. And it is about freedom. And that's something we should all be able to just get behind.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what you just said was really well put, and it's like, this is also like the crux of the entire idea of internationalism and solidarity, is to recognize that we are in this communal fight, this global fight with its own particularities that are regional and country specific, but this belief that everyone deserves to be able to live in a more prosperous and freer future, and to deny people their agency to go out and demand and fight for that, I found to be extremely frustrating.
Sorry, because you brought up their agency, I just wanted to mention one thing. So that's exactly it, right? Then there's another side of this argument, which is Iranians have agency. Of course they do. Everybody does. So they are exercising that agency right now, and we should be able to recognize it. But we should have been able to recognize it when they exercised the agency in other ways before. Protest is not the only way in which people exercise agency. So, for instance, when they were celebrating the deal in 2015, the nuclear deal, that's their agency as well, right? Those were also Iranians in the streets celebrating something because they believed at the time. Now, we can't, what happened in the past doesn't mean that it's always the same sentiment. But at the time, we could conclude that Iranians wanted the deal. They wanted sanctions relief. They wanted detente with the US. And it's not just the scenes of them celebrating that you would use as evidence of that. The fact that in 2017, 70% of the voting population turned out to vote and re-elected the Rouhani administration really because of the deal is another act of agency. And so when we point out that in 2021, in this election, they didn't turn out to vote. It was the lowest voter turnout since the revolution, less than 50%. Millions of those ballots were blank, right? That was a choice. They sent in blank ballots as a form of protest. That is agency as well. It's all agency. Those are always decisions that they've made. So when some people say, well, the elections don't matter, I'm like, well, then why did 70% vote? And then all of a sudden, like 25% less people voted. That's a massive difference. Those are millions of people. Raisi, the current president, he was soundly defeated in 2017. He was the one running against Rouhani in 2017, this very same person who is now president. So that shows you that when they chose to turn out to vote, it made a difference to the outcome. And so all I'm trying to say is listen to them, right? Like that's agency too. So we should have been listening to them then, and we should be listening to them now.
I mean, are we okay on time? I had two more things I was hoping to get to, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, while we're sort of, talking, about some arguments that we see here, I've read some of your stuff on Twitter recently. I think making another really important point, because when you see in the West, in like Canada and in France, these kind of wars on wearing the hijab, and supporting people who choose to express themselves in that way, the right sometimes attacks the left for saying, look, they're being hypocritical, right? They're saying in the United States or in the West they want them to wear them, but in Iran maybe not. I mean, could you sort of talk about why that kind of argument perspective also gets that very, very wrong too?
There's this, I forgot when it was from, but there's this great like political cartoon where, and it's like a really short, I think, animation where it's just a woman standing in the center and two men standing around her, and one keeps putting the hijab on her and one keeps pulling it off. And that very simple animation to me made so much sense because that's ultimately the fact that it was two men, right? The fact that it's this conversation about women's autonomy without women most of the time, whether it's in the West, whether it's in the Middle East, wherever you're talking about. Ultimately, patriarchal systems are ubiquitous across the world. And so that's another thing, right? You're sitting here, you have US politicians who are so outspoken for women's rights in Iran, and yet they're stripping American women of their rights simultaneously. Like, as they are standing in solidarity with Iranian women and their rights, they are taking rights away from American women with their own legislation, with their own decision making, with their own language. So there's that level of hypocrisy, which is extremely frustrating. And then there's the fact that Islamophobic comments are not helpful, right? This is the questions of choice. That's what it is. They should have a choice. So if you are defending the right of Iranian women not to have to wear a hijab, which I 100% support, then you should also be defending the right of women in, say, France or in any other Western country that doesn't want them to wear it. Mm-hmm. That's the problem. And if you look at Iran's own history, that pendulum has swung in both directions, right? If you just look at the case of Iran, you had, like I said, in the earlier, the first Pahlavi monarch, Reza Shah, restricted women's attire. And that caused a lot of resentment within certain circles within the country. And now you have a government in the same country that imposes it. And they're both equally wrong. They're both wrong. And in both cases, when that pendulum swings, all you get is resistance from the other side. So it's actually quite simple. It's choice. You give them choice. And that has been another problem in this discourse is appropriating this protest, this movement that is for freedom, in order to justify taking other people's freedoms away. That's not what's at the core of it. They're not burning their hijabs because they think everybody has to. They're doing it because they don't want to wear it themselves.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that puts it well. I mean, yeah, I don't know. That's always been a gotcha too. That gets me very frustrated.
To me, it's wild. Like this conversation, it reminds me of like when I'm first like trying to educate yourself, and I mean, people like Sam Harris are in like forcing us into these. I'm like 16 trying to find out about the world, and one of the big controversies in the mid 2000s is should people be forced to take off their hijabs in like courtrooms? And it's like, why is this? What's the subtext here? And why is this like the sort of angle of inquiry that we're taking? And it's clear that it's paternalism.
And
It's just,
Islamophobia. Yeah.
I mean, it's sometimes in these discussions, it's like we don't understand what the concept even is. Like, what does freedom mean then? If you once you and the problem is that slippery slope that we talk about, and that's why I brought up Iran's history, right? Iran is a country
Hmm.
where both have been attempted, and both have been resisted, because ultimately that's all that people are asking for. They're asking for the freedom to do something. And so when that like thread comes into the conversation, it always feels a little bit more Islamophobic than it does anything else, right?
Mhm.
Why and because why is it focused on Muslim women? Orthodox Jewish women don't show their hair either. They wear wigs.
Hmm.
I don't know why, it would be absurd to attack them for doing so. They should be able to do whatever they want to do. You wouldn't, you don't I mean, that's the whole point of freedom of religion. Like, we
Mhm.
say the cornerstone of this country is freedom of religion, but then you have people who think, well, you shouldn't allow women to wear a hijab. And that's if a individual Muslim woman identifies with that and makes that choice, then that should be it. Ultimately, it's a choice. It should be a choice, I should say.
Well, in the last couple of minutes, I wanted to ask you something. We talked about some of the ways, how important it is to show solidarity. I was wondering, if you might want to speak a little bit to, like, the best ways that people can, in the United States in particular, can be showing solidarity, and two, specifically, like your experience as, a member of like the diaspora, like somebody who's not in Iran right now but has a lot of family members there, is dealing with that moment when you might not be able to communicate with people. Also give people a sense of, like, what your experience with this is, and what's the best way that people who care and want to support people can do so.
I think the first thing is just to show solidarity, to share their voices, don't just let this be a trend, if that makes
Hmm.
sense.
Hmm.
Sometimes news stories can become trendy, and then everybody changes their avatars, and then suddenly the next thing happens. And it's not about, I understand, because there are a lot of uh unfortunately horrible things happening to people all over the world, and I'm in no way trying to reduce that. That's not how I mean it. I mean it more in the sense of, let let's not just make this a 2-day news cycle. Let's, show support by learning about it. And I've had, to be honest with you, I've had a few people who've reached out to me, and have asked questions. They've just asked questions because they wanted to learn about it. And that's I don't expect everybody to do that, because people, if we it's not fair to expect everyone to become educated on every political event that happens in the world, because there's just too much going on. But just sharing their stories, not letting it fall through the cracks. I think that's one of the things, saying out loud, voicing the fact that you're showing solidarity. If you are, as an American, right, making sure that our policies don't make anything worse, and that's it, just that they don't make them worse. And an example of that is, at our organization, we tried to. There are the internet shutdowns are happening on the Iranian end, right? The Iranian government is trying to control the internet. But there are some services that are blocked to Iranians on the American side because of sanctions, right? Certain
Mhm.
platforms that are blocked. And, I think a lot of people saw, like, Elon Musk
Mm.
tweeted something very quickly saying, I want an exemption from sanctions for Starlink. Now, why did he say that? Because there are sanctions in place that, if certain American companies want to do anything, they have to get permissions to be able to do it. Now, we've been advocating for this for years, right? Back in 2019, when there were protests and the Iranian government shut it down, we were saying, look, we can't control them, but we can control ourselves. We can make sure that our policies are at least not hurting them even more, and maybe create. And now you see this sort of push to, let's create the infrastructure so that they can have access to the internet. And in my mind, it becomes, well, had you done it then, they,
Hmm.
maybe that infrastructure would already be in place. So making sure that our policies are not hurting them any more than is necessary, that we're not inadvertently aiding the ability of the Iranian government to suppress them, or block them from the internet, something like that. And then, I think the last thing for me is just, well, actually, not the last thing. There's two more things. One thing I was going to say is, in terms of when you look at it through an internationalist lens, when you look at it as an international community, I think that we will be much more effective at holding actors accountable when we do it consistently. It's like as simple as that.
Mhm.
I know I say that and it's like most people should understand this and it's intuitive, but we don't actually do it. And systems of accountability, the language of human rights, the language of international law, while it is, while I agree with it and I aspire towards it, we don't actually do it. And so it doesn't have the power that it should have because there's this inconsistency in accountability. So really thinking about that, how we use these institutions to hold actors accountable is contingent on the ability to be consistently accountable. And then the last thing, which is somewhat more for my own community, but just people who are outside of our community as well, outside of the diaspora community or anything like that, who are politically engaged in this topic, is to try and just have a little bit of grace towards one another, to
Mhm.
understand that there is a lot of there's a lot of concern, there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of worry, especially for people in the diaspora who have family there. Um, they're having Everyone's very worried, and that can create a lot of just unfortunate sort of politics that go back and forth. And some things, in my mind, freedom is not political. I
Mhm.
don't think it is. Maybe that sounds silly. Maybe that sounds naive for me to say it, but I don't think that this is a politicized thing. I think believing that a woman should be free to dress how she wants is pretty basic, and we can all get behind it. And there should be moments where we put certain political differences aside to be able to show that solidarity. And so that would be my only last point, is to try and realize that and look past our recognize that other people are often coming from places of trauma, but also like recognize our own and try to have just, I don't know, cooperative conversation, something that actually is useful rather than just anger that goes back and forth sometimes.
Mm.
No, I think that's excellent advice. Um, Asal, we really appreciate you taking some time to speak with us today. People should be sure to follow Asal and her work. We'll have links below for people to check that out. And again, just really appreciate you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Assal.
Thank you both for taking the time and for covering this. I really appreciate it.